Hey there, grace and peace to you all today. Captain Roger from the Hanford Corps of the Salvation Army. Welcome to the Shield Online, our weekly worship and study time. You know, once a while back, there were 4 men. Well, there were actually more than 4. I don't really know how many altogether, but the guy I heard this from mentioned others being part of the group and called out these 4. What they were doing was carrying another man in kind of a makeshift sling. And that's hard work, so they do deserve a little extra attention, I think. The guy they were carrying was quadriplegic, full body paralysis. He wasn't very old. I think probably in his 20s. In our world, maybe he'd have been in one of those scooters that he could drive around by pushing a lever with his head to make it go where he wanted. But this was back before they had things like that. What he had were people who were willing to carry him, at least this time. And they were taking him to see a doctor. Well, okay, doctor's maybe not the right term. Maybe I should say healer or witch doctor to be more accurate. It was this guy they'd heard about who had helped some other folks, or that they had heard had helped some other folks, and he lived nearby. So when they heard that he was home, they went over to see if there was anything that could be done about their friend. And I say he was a friend because they were willing to carry him. A lot of folks wouldn't have done that. And there's no way that anyone other than good friends would have done what these guys ended up doing, but I'll get to that. Now, when they got to the place where the healer was living, there was this big party going on. I guess he'd been gone for a while, and when he got back, there were a bunch of folks trying to get in to see him. And so the waiting room was full, as it were, and there was this line at the door, and there wasn't anyone taking names to get on the list to get in. And I don't know how the conversation in this little friend group went, but when they realized they weren't going to be able to get in, they kind of put their heads together and tried to work out what to do next. Should they wait until tomorrow and start earlier in the day? Maybe they could get in before the line. But would the guy even be there tomorrow? I mean, healers didn't keep normal office hours or anything like that. Maybe they'd better figure out how to get in today. But it was obvious that just standing at the back of the line wasn't going to work for that. Not today. Too many people. And then one of them had this idea, and it was crazy, of course. I'm sure this is the guy we all have one of in our friend groups, the one who is forever making just these wild suggestions and claiming to have done even crazier things than whatever it is they just suggested, so why not just trust them and go with it, and you can all laugh about it later, right? Yeah, so that guy, he said he had an idea, and I'm sure there was some eye rolling and at least one friend who insisted that they shouldn't listen to whatever this guy was about to suggest, but that friend was, well, they were probably right about that, frankly. But that guy, he led this group of people around the side of the house where there was this kind of a fire escape going up to the roof. And the others were all like, what? No, well, that's not going to help. But he was all, I got an idea. But we've got to get up there so I can see if it'll work. And having nothing better to do and being young enough to have more desire for action than brains to just stay with the group like real adults, they picked up their corners of the stretcher and they hauled their friend up these steep stairs to the roof. And I'm sure he was thrilled, by which I mean absolutely certain that this was a bad idea. So they get up on the roof, and the mastermind who got him up here starts looking around and realizes there is no secret hatch or door that opens into the house. Because of course there isn't. It wasn't an area that got a lot of rain, but when it did rain, it rained hard, and no one wants a waterfall in their living room, do they? No, so you don't poke a hole in your roof. Yeah, but this guy's not done. He starts kind of poking himself at the big flat tiles on the roof. He manages to get his finger underneath the corner one, and he pries it right up and sets it off next to the edge of the roof. And I think they're all getting a little worried at this point, but he just kept saying he knew what he was doing. I know what I'm doing. I know what I'm doing. So when he starts to dig, I'm sure they all figured, well, we're already screwed here. Why not? The roof was adobe. It's this mesh of mud and long wires of grass layered one over the other again and again until it was pretty thick. But once you have a half dozen guys chipping away at it, it would have chunked out pretty quickly. It wasn't like a clean cut or anything, and the repair was probably going to take a lot more work than any of them thought about. But once you've committed to doing something stupid, you just kind of keep going, right? Well, when one of them broke through, making this little hole into the house, then they all start pulling at the clay and crumbling it up to shove it aside or push it down into the crack as they made the opening bigger and bigger. so that they'll be able to get a whole human being to fit through it, right? And then as they made it wider, that's when they can see through, and they realize that there are about 50 people down there completely covered in dust, just staring up at them with that utter look of amazement that you have when someone has done something so monumentally stupid you can't even find words to yell at them. And that's when the guy whose idea this was says, okay, now we need to get him down there. And I am sure, absolutely sure, that at least one of the others objected. But now there are people yelling at them, and there's also no escaping that they had just ripped a hole in the healer's roof, so why not finish big, right? Yeah, right. So they quick tie the edges of the mat to their friend so that he wouldn't just get dumped onto his face. And then they swung him around down into the room. And after swinging him back and forth a little bit, because they had to do that, they were able to drop him, more or less, right into the arms of some of the men in the room below. At which point, they realized that the man they had come to see was right there. And he was watching this whole process with this particularly penetrating gaze that made them feel like he was looking right into their souls. Now, this healer, whose name was Jesus, he looked down at that man who'd been dropped onto his floor, and then he looked up at the hole in the roof and that circle of faces looking down to see what he was going to do. And Jesus, he raised a hand, quieted the room and all the loud complaints coming from these dust-covered spectators inside. And then he knelt down beside that paralyzed man, and with kind of a bemused tone in his voice, he locked his eyes on the man's face and he said, "Child, your sins are forgiven." And the room went still. Some of the older men there, elders and teachers from the town, they were looking at him with these pretty shocked looks. What did he just say? Only God could forgive sins or know that they'd been forgiven. How dare this village healer presume to... And then Jesus stood up and fixed his gaze on them. And now there's a whole new tension in the room. Almost enough to distract from the hole and the dirt and the surprised young man lying unmoving on the floor, and Jesus began speaking as if those teachers had said something that everyone else had missed. He asked, "Why are you thinking these things?" And there was a pause as he met the eyes of one and then another and then the next, all the way around that circle of elders. Why are you thinking these things? Which is easier, to say to this paralyzed man, "Your sins are forgiven," or to say, "Get up, take your mat, and walk"? There was another pause. Well, he made sure they were all paying close attention, and then Jesus continued, "But I want you to know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins." So he turned his focus back to the man lying on this rubble-strewn floor, and he spoke, "I tell you, get up, take your mat, and go home." And moving with deliberate slowness, the man untangled the straps tied to his body, then rolled over onto his knees, and then stood up. And for a moment, no one moved. And the guy reached down, he grabbed the corner of that sling he'd been in, and again, slowly, gingerly, as if he's trying to avoid waking himself up from a particularly meaningful dream, the man rolled that tangle of cloth and tucked it up under his arm and walked towards the door. The crowd pulled back far enough for him to have a clear path. He stopped once. He looked back to Jesus from the doorway, and there's this whole spectrum of awe and gratitude readable on his face. And then he was gone into the crowd outside where everyone could see. And the room erupted. People were praising God, shouting to each other, unable to believe what they had seen. They were crying out with amazement and joy for this young man who now had a whole life ahead of him, one that he never would have had otherwise. And as his friends came down from the roof and surrounded him, the joy of the group and the stories they all told about what just happened spread through the crowd and through the town and into the history of incredible things done by this incredible man, Jesus. I really hope someone fixed his roof before it rained. Now, there's two somethings, in fact, that strike me about this story. The first is that what Jesus sees as needing to be fixed was different from what anyone else thought needed to be fixed. For the people inside, it was probably the roof. I mean, this group of young men had callously ripped a hole in the healer's house, for heaven's sake. What an invasion. Have they no shame? For the people who were bringing their friend to a man with a reputation for healing, it was their friend's paralysis. In an unforgiving world that made no accommodations of any kind for the disabled, his condition made him seem broken. They thought of him as needing to be tended. He was vulnerable, unable to care for himself, or even to contribute to his care in the normal way of their people. But to Jesus, the only thing he saw that needed to be helped was the man's soul. Child, your sins are forgiven. I wonder if we've even thought about that man's paralysis being a disability. You know, there was a time, you remember I'm old, there was a time back in the 90s where we were all being told not to use that word disabled anymore. Instead, we were to acknowledge that some people were just differently abled. And at the time, I may have seen that more as an affectation than a real status. But as I have found myself, with my minor physical limitations, lumped into that larger group of people who are disabled, I've been more open to the idea that the various kinds of brokenness people may have to deal with don't mean that they are in any way unable. Thinking about the people that I know or have known who have conditions we call disabilities, I have to say that most of them really are completely able, even if not in the same way as your average human being, if there is such a thing. We all have gifts that we can use and share. We just don't all do that the same way. And thank God for that. What a boring world it would be where everyone was the same. I mean, maybe I will never slam dunk a basketball again, but you know what? I could never do that anyway. Does that mean I am less able than an NBA superstar? No, it means I am differently abled. I'm sure I can do things that some of those guys are utterly incapable of. I have one friend who lost most of a hand in an accident, but he ran a warehouse with dexterity I never had, even when I was perfectly healthy. Stephen Hawking had ALS. He was confined to a wheelchair. He spoke by typing one letter at a time by twitching the muscles of one cheek. But he redefined our view of the cosmos. He connected quantum theory, black holes, and relativity, and then wrote a book explaining it all in layman's terms so that anyone who cares to can understand how some of the most mysterious parts of creation work. Did Jesus think that young man was disabled by his body's refusal to do what his mind asked it to? Apparently not. Apparently it was not what he thought mattered. Child, your sins are forgiven. Which is the second thing that strikes me. Jesus didn't heal the man's body because the man needed it. It wasn't the faith of the man or his friends that prompted that healing. Oh, we're told that Jesus saw their faith and that prompted him to act. Child, your sins are forgiven. But it wasn't that which inspired him to restore health to the body. In fact, it's the opposite of that. It was the unbelief of the very people who should have been the most receptive to the idea of forgiveness, the religious leadership. Hearing what Jesus said, they weren't interested in the man's sins being forgiven. Instead, they immediately tried to add sin to the world by accusing Jesus of blaspheming God by declaring the man blameless. How dare he go around telling people they're forgiven? They thought they knew better, that they could judge either the soul of the paralyzed man or the soul and intention of Jesus. So Jesus demonstrated that he had the authority they assumed no one had by doing something else they thought they knew couldn't happen. With no magic, no medicine, no mysterious rites or rituals, he told the man to get up, take his mat, and go home. Changed so that his outside was restored just like his inside was. That man wasn't healed once. He was healed twice. Once of what mattered, and once of something that should not have. Jesus wants to heal what matters, and that may not be what you think matters. So if you're praying for some kind of healing or restoration and you think that it's never come, don't be discouraged. Maybe you should be asking, is there a better way for you to pray? In one of his letters to the Corinthians, Paul said he'd been pleading with God to remove what he called a thorn in my flesh. What he learned eventually was that God's grace is sufficient, and that what Paul had thought of as a weakness was something the Lord was going to use to show that we could trust him. Paul wrote that this is why, for the sake of Christ, he would delight in weakness, insults, hardships, persecutions, and difficulties. He had realized these things weren't disabilities, they were opportunities to be differently abled. They were opportunities to show people the glory of God in all things. Now, for the next few weeks, maybe more, we're going to look at some of the other stories of Jesus. Seems like a good way to start the year. I hope you agree. Grace and peace to each of you today and for the week to come. Whoever you are, wherever you are, I want you to remember one very important thing. God is with you. There is nowhere you can be in this world that God isn't already there. All you need to do is turn and go with God. See you all next time.